The music had stopped, but her hand was still gripping my arm like she was afraid to let go. I'd worked under Diane Castellano for almost a year, and in that entire time I had never once seen her hands shake. Not when the Fortune 500 client walked out of a meeting. Not when half the marketing team got laid off in the same week she'd been promoted to VP. Not even the time a contractor screamed at her in the parking garage over a payment dispute, while I stood there pretending to look for my car keys so I wouldn't have to leave her alone with him. Diane Castellano did not shake. That was sort of the whole legend of her. So when I felt her fingers trembling against my forearm in the middle of the company's 20th anniversary dinner, it didn't register right away. I thought maybe it was the cold from the open terrace doors. I thought maybe I was imagining it. It took me a second too long to look up at her face and understand that something in the building had cracked, and nobody else in that ballroom had noticed yet but me. My name is Jonah Reyes, and 2 years ago I was 26 years old, 6 months away from quitting the only job that had ever made me feel like I might actually become someone. I should back up. I grew up outside Tulsa in a house my dad built additions onto himself because we couldn't afford a contractor. He drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor for 19 years. My mom did billing for a dental office. Neither of them went to college, and they didn't pretend that bothered them. But I knew it did, a little. In the quiet way, parents carry disappointment about their own lives so their kids don't have to inherit it. What they gave me instead of monies was a kind of stubborn decency. You show up, you don't half do things. You don't complain about a job you're lucky to have. I believed all of that with my whole chest by the time I left for college on a partial scholarship and student loans I'm still paying off. I landed an entry-level analyst position at Castellano & Reeve, a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, right out of grad school. Getting hired there felt like the first real proof that the last 4 years hadn't been wasted. I remember calling my mom from the parking lot after the offer call, and both of us going quiet on the phone for a second too long. Diane Castellano was a partner there, one of the firm's 2 founders, and she ran the client strategy division I'd been placed in. People in the office called her the glacier behind her back, not unkindly exactly, but with the specific awe people reserve for something they respect and are slightly afraid of. She was maybe 44, always in the same rotation of tailored charcoal and navy, hair pulled back so severely. It looked less like a hairstyle and more like a decision. She didn't do small talk. She didn't ask about your weekend. In meetings, she had this habit of letting silence sit after you finished a sentence, just long enough for you to realize you should have prepared better, and then she'd ask one question that exposed the weakest part of whatever you'd presented. For the first few months, I told myself she was just rigorous. By month 4, I'd started to believe she just didn't think I was good enough to bother being warm to. It wasn't dramatic. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. She'd read my reports and hand them back with 3 lines circled in red and no explanation. She'd ask me a question in a client prep meeting that I didn't have the answer to, and instead of moving on, she'd let it hang there until I admitted I didn't know, and then she'd simply nod and move to the next person. My emails to her got one-line replies. Noted. Revise and resend. See me. I started dreading the sound of my own name when she said it across the office. I told myself I could take it. I'd taken worse, growing up the way I did, working 2 jobs through undergrad. But there's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from working incredibly hard for someone who you're convinced has already decided you don't matter. It hollows you out slower than failure does, because you can't even point to a single moment and say, that's when it went wrong. It's just attrition. By the spring, I had started, quietly, looking. I'd gone on 2 interviews on my lunch breaks, lying about dentist appointments. Neither panned out, but the third one, a smaller firm in Raleigh, felt promising, and I had a final round interview scheduled for the Monday after the anniversary dinner. I'd more or less made peace with leaving. I had even started drafting my resignation letter in a Google Doc on my personal laptop, the cursor blinking under a sentence I kept rewriting. I've valued my time here, but I've decided to pursue an opportunity that's a better fit for my growth. I didn't believe a word of that sentence. I just didn't know how to write the true one. The 20th anniversary dinner was mandatory, held at a renovated textile mill-turned-event space near Uptown Charlotte, the kind of place with exposed brick and Edison bulbs strung across the ceiling like the building was apologizing for its industrial past. There were maybe 200 employees there, plus spouses, plus a scattering of major clients the firm wanted to flatter. Open bar, a jazz trio, a slideshow of old client logos that nobody was watching. I almost didn't go. I told myself I'd make an appearance, eat something off a past tray, and leave within the hour. I put on the one suit I owned that didn't have a coffee stain ghosted into the lapel, and I drove over straight from the office, still tired from a 10-hour day building slide decks for a client renewal Diane hadn't even thanked me for. She arrived almost 40 minutes late, which I'd never known her to do. When she walked in, something about the room recalibrated around her the way it always did. Black dress, simple, the kind that costs more specifically by looking like it doesn't try. But something was off. She wasn't making her usual circuit, working the room with that brisk, efficient warmth she reserved for clients. She stood near the edge of the space by the bar, holding a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, and her eyes kept cutting toward the exit doors like she was doing math on how soon she could leave without it being noticed. I watched her for longer than I should have. Maybe 10 minutes, long enough that one of my coworkers, Marcus from the audit team, leaned over and said, "What's going on with the glacier tonight? She looks like she saw a ghost." I told him I didn't know. I genuinely didn't. The trio shifted into something slower, one of those standards that exists specifically to get reluctant couples onto a dance floor, and a handful of pairs drifted out under the string lights. Diane stayed against the wall, alone. Nobody approached her. I understood why. Approaching Diane Castellano uninvited at a work function was the kind of thing that ended careers in office mythology, even if it had probably never actually happened to anyone. I don't fully know what made me walk over. I've turned it over 100 times since. Maybe it was that I had nothing left to lose with her, since I was already halfway out the door professionally. Maybe it was simpler than that. She just looked like someone standing alone at the edge of a room who needed somebody not to leave her there. I crossed the floor before I could talk myself out of it and held out my hand. "Would you want to dance, Diane?" She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. For a second, I thought she was going to say something cutting, something that would end this small, stupid act of bravery before it started. Instead, something in her face just gave way a little. She set the wine glass down on a high-top table without looking at it and put her hand in mine. We stepped out onto the floor and I felt eyes on us almost instantly, the particular electricity of people pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. I didn't care. I was focused on her hand. It was shaking. Not nerves before a presentation shaking, real trembling. The kind that comes from somewhere underneath whatever a person usually lets you see. When she finally lifted her eyes to mine, they were glassy in a way I had never once seen in a year of working 12 feet from her office door. For the first time since I'd met her, Diane Castellano looked like a person instead of an institution. We moved slowly, not really dancing so much as swaying, the way two strangers do when neither of them actually knows the steps, and both are grateful for an excuse not to talk. The noise of the party, glasses clinking, that low roar of 100 half-finished conversations seemed to recede, like someone had turned a dial down on the rest of the room. I could feel the tension sitting in her shoulders, coiled and exhausted at the same time. I didn't ask her what was wrong. Some instinct told me that if I asked directly, she'd snap back into the glacier, apologize for being unprofessional, and the moment would close like a door. So I just let the music carry us and said nothing, and after a long stretch of silence, she was the one who spoke first. Her voice, when it came, didn't sound like the voice that ran client meetings. It was quieter, frayed at the edges. She told me that 4 hours earlier she'd gotten a call from the firm's largest client, a regional healthcare network that made up almost a third of Castellano and Reeves' annual revenue. They were terminating the engagement, effective at the end of the quarter after 11 years. A new CFO had come in wanting to consolidate services in-house. There had been no warning, no negotiation window. Diane had spent the 4 hours between that call and the dinner on the phone with her co-founder and 2 board members, trying to figure out how to keep this from triggering layoffs. And then she'd had to put on a black dress and come smile at 200 people and pretend the night was about celebrating 20 years, instead of possibly the beginning of the end of the firm she'd built from a 2-person office in 2004. She told me this without looking at me, her eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like saying it directly to my face would make it more real than it already was. I felt something shift in my chest as she spoke. All the resentment I'd been carrying around for months, the red-circled reports, the clipped emails, the silences in meetings. It all suddenly looked very small next to a woman quietly unraveling in real time while 200 people ate shrimp cocktail 12 feet away. I didn't know, I said, which was a stupid thing to say, but it was honest. She let out something that wasn't quite a laugh. Nobody knows yet. The board meets Thursday. I told her, before I could think better of it, that I'd assumed for most of the past year that she didn't think I was good enough to be there. That I'd planned, more than once, to quit because I figured I was disappointing her and didn't know how to stop. I don't know why I told her that in that moment on a dance floor, with 100 people's eyes occasionally drifting our way. I think some part of me needed her to know the truth before whatever this was ended. She actually stopped moving for a second. Looked at me like I'd said something in a language she had to translate. Then she shook her head, slowly, and told me I had it backward. She said she circled things in my reports because she read every line of my work. While most junior analysts' reports, she barely skimmed before signing off. She said the silences in meetings weren't punishment. They were her giving me room to find the answer myself instead of handing it to me, because she'd watched too many smart people get ruined by managers who did their thinking for them. She said, and her voice actually caught here just slightly, that she'd told her co-founder twice in the past 6 months that I was one of the only analysts on the floor she trusted to eventually run a book of business himself. I hadn't known any of that, not one piece of it. Then she told me the part that actually stopped my breathing for a second. She said that earlier that week, she'd stopped by my desk after hours to drop off a signed expense form, and my laptop had been open, the Google Doc still up on the screen. She hadn't meant to read it, but she'd seen the first line of my draft resignation letter glowing there in the dark office, and she'd stood there for a full minute before she made herself walk away. That was why she'd looked the way she did when she walked tonight, she admitted. It wasn't only the healthcare client. It was the cumulative, almost unbearable thought that on top of possibly losing a third of the firm's revenue, she might also be about to lose the one junior analyst she'd quietly built plans around, because she'd been too proud or too guarded or too used to keeping people at arm's length to ever just tell him he mattered. The song was ending. Neither of us moved to step apart. She looked at me directly then, and for the first time in a year, Diane Castellano didn't look like the glacier at all. She looked like someone standing at the edge of something and asking, without quite knowing how to ask, for somebody to stay. I know I'm not good at this, she said. Her hand tightened slightly around mine. I've spent 20 years thinking the firm runs on strategy and results. It doesn't. It runs on people staying when they have every reason to leave, she paused. Please don't go, Jonah. Not because of the firm. I mean, don't leave. Not yet. I stood there on that dance floor in a borrowed kind of stillness, the band packing up their stands behind us, and I understood something I hadn't fully understood before, that the people who look the most unbreakable are very often the ones holding the most weight alone, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone isn't to fix their problem. It's to simply not walk away from them while they're carrying it. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, not because I suddenly had it all figured out, and not because one conversation erased a year of feeling small, but because for the first time, I understood why she'd been the way she was, and that understanding mattered more to me than the easier path of leaving. I canceled the Raleigh interview Monday morning. I never told Marcus or anyone else in the office what had actually happened that night. Some things you keep for yourself, not out of shame, but because they're too fragile to survive being turned into office gossip. The next several months were brutal. The healthcare client's exit did trigger a round of belt-tightening. 2 positions were eliminated through attrition, though not mine. Diane and her co-founder spent weeks rebuilding the firm's pipeline, and for the first time, she started pulling me and 2 other analysts into strategy sessions that used to happen entirely behind her closed door. She started asking what we thought before she told us what she thought, which was new, and which took some getting used to, because I think it took her a while to get used to it too. She still circles things in red. She still lets silences sit in meetings a beat longer than feels comfortable. She is, by any honest measure, still demanding and still one of the sharpest people I've ever worked for. But there's something different now, something that shows up in small ways. She remembers that my mom had a hip surgery and asks about her recovery, unprompted. She told the whole floor, in a meeting 8 months ago, that the renewed healthcare contract we eventually landed with a competing network came directly from a strategy I'd proposed. And she said it without being asked in front of everyone, which from her was the equivalent of a standing ovation, 2 years out, Castellano and Reeve isn't just stable, it's bigger than it was before that anniversary dinner, with 2 new verticals and a client roster that's more diversified than it's ever been. I made senior analyst this past winter. Diane was the one who told me, and for just a second before she handed me the offer letter, she smiled in that rare way that still catches people off guard in meetings. I think about that dance more than I'd probably admit out loud, not because anything romantic ever came of it. It didn't, and it was never that kind of moment, even though I know people will wonder. It mattered for a simpler reason. It taught me that the people who seem the most untouchable are usually just the most tired, and that the difference between a workplace that breaks people and one that holds them together can come down to something as small as one person deciding, on one ordinary terrible night, not to walk away.